Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today, we are returning to everyone's favorite topic, Adolf Hitler. For this episode, you have me, P.H. Jones, also known as Georgi K. Zukov on the subreddit.
And me, Johannes Breit, also known as Call Me Space Invader on the subreddit.
As promised in our last episode concerning the suicide of Adolf Hitler and the rumors of his survival, we are now back to talk about one of the oddest episodes of Hitler scholarship, the Hitler Diaries. This was an episode that unfolded through the early 1980s and took in a number of famous and some infamous also historians in a wild romp of an historical episode. To start things off, Joe, take it away.
Thank you so much. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it is considered one of the biggest publishing frauds in history, still to this day. And it all started with a yacht, to be precise, with Hermann Göring's yacht. The boat named Karin II, in remembrance of both his first wife and presumably his first boat, was a luxury boat given originally to Göring by the Association of German Automobile Manufacturers in 1937. It was huge. And after his death in Nuremberg, it passed into the possession of the British Royal Navy, who used it as part of their flotilla on the River Rhine. It served as the HMS Royal Albert and the HMS Prince Charles, and then it changed hands quite considerably over the next couple of years, until it was found one fateful day in 1973 by a man named Gerd Heidemann. Heidemann was a photographer and reporter for the German magazine Stern. He had followed his passion to pursue photography and had joined Stern after the war at 18 years old in 1948, which was a large German post-war magazine conceived by a German media figure named Henry Nannen. Before his purchase of Göring's yacht, Heidemann had worked on several projects for Stern, including hunting down the real identity of the mysterious novelist and author of the book The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, Beethoven, and being a war photographer in Congo. Heidemann had always the tendency to get involved in weird conspiracy stories. He had believed that Draven was an illegitimate child of Wilhelm II, for example, during his research, as well as becoming obsessed with a variety of topics before. And this time it was to be Göring's yacht and the Nazis. For him, he said later on, the yacht was an impulse buy as much as one is impulsive to buy a yacht, but he thought it might be fun. He had just made his boating license and was interested in doing a piece about its history for Stern now that he had bought it. And slowly, over the next couple of years, he not only got into an affair with Hermann Göring's daughter, who he got to know via owning the boat, but also built up a very active social circle of former Nazis living in West Germany. These included, but were not limited to, Wilhelm Mohncke, commander of the German garrison defending the Reichstag, Karl Wolff, the liaison between Hitler and Himmler and former high SS and police leader in Italy, Hitler's various secretaries who were still alive, and a whole gaggle of other former Nazis and members of Hitler's personal staff. Apparently, they called themselves the Mountain People for having had the privilege to spend time at the Berghof with Hitler. And these were the people with whom Heidemann started having regular soirees on board of Göring's former yacht, Karin II.
Given their fond recollection, is it safe to say that a lot of these were not exactly reformed former Nazis?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say that they were neo-Nazis in the sense that they were working politically to resurrect Nazism at some point, because at least some of them were involved with right-wing politics in Germany, while others were quite unrepentant and were mostly concerned about keeping their head down. I think it was Wolff who still had an arrest warrant out for him in the early 70s. So basically, they were his Nazi friends. And I mean, they liked hanging out with him because it was basically like they had their little bunker reunions from 1945. Like most of them had spent time with Hitler in the bunker in Berlin, and now they were all just hanging out with Heidemann on Göring's yacht. Like there was this weird guy who had bought the boat and had started a love affair with Göring's daughter, and now he was inviting them all over. And it gets even weirder. At some point, Heidemann breaks up with Göring's daughter and meets his new wife, Gina, who he meets through their favorite shared passion, Nazi memorabilia collecting. And they get married in 1979, and for their honeymoon, they go to South America together with General Karl Wolff to meet Klaus Barbie and search for Martin Bormann.
Who, of course, was dead at that point, we should add. And not just suspected dead, they literally found his body 1973? No, it might have been 1972. They found his body, they identified him, and people still wanted to think he was alive, which nice tie back to what we've already talked about in our last episode.
Exactly, and absurdly, it was a colleague of Heidemann's from Stern, Jochen von Lang, who had written the initial breaking story about Bormann's death. He was the one who had reported initially on the whole thing, and I think it was Jochen von Lang who also introduced originally Karl Wolff and Heidemann rather than Edda Göring, but I'm not sure about that detail. But he knew definitely that somebody at his magazine had written about Bormann being fucking dead. But anyway, Heidemann, through his soirees at Carinth at the boat, enters and gets involved into this somewhat shadowy milieu of former Nazi officials, their hang-ons, and the whole Nazi memorabilia collector scene in West Germany, which, you know, is always kind of suspect because it involves a lot of people who are also into right-wing and neo-Nazi politics.
You see that in the US too. I like to collect old firearms, as you know, and I'll go to gun shows, and there's always that one guy who has that table.
It seems like a weird kind of passion to have. I mean, this whole affair also started the whole trend of collecting real fake Hitler memorabilia, which we will get to at some point, but there is a whole lot of like collection weirdness involved. And I think that the man who embodies that in this case best is a man named Franz Stiefel, who was a German industrialist who lived in Stuttgart, and he was an avid collector of Nazi memorabilia and owned probably one of the largest collections of Nazi and war memorabilia and antiques in Germany, if not internationally. Heidemann had heard rumors that among Stiefel's various treasures was a volume of the diary of Adolf Hitler. And he was gobsmacked by that fact and immediately went to track Stiefel down. And because they shared so many passions, and because owning Göring's yacht opens doors to you in these circles, Stiefel brought him in, and he visited him in his mansion, and Stiefel opened his secret room, windowless room, brightly lit, full of glass cabinets with swastika flags, Nazi medals, photographs, paintings, books, drawings, and many, many more things. And from that treasure hoard, Stiefel hands Heidemann a slim A4 book with hard black covers and the Gothic letters AH on the cover. Now, one of my favorite details about this whole thing is that the guy who forged all of these, a man named Konrad Kujau, didn't buy the right Gothic letters to put on the front. He bought FH instead of AH, but the F looked like an A, so... And it fooled everyone involved. Like, everyone did not realize that the Gothic letters on the front were said FH instead of AH and were made in Hong Kong. So Stiefel shows him this first volume of the diary with FH on the cover. And it supposedly covers the period from January to June 1935. It was filled in a script that Heidemann couldn't really read because it was not even Fraktur. It was basically German cursive, but old cursive. And it was underwhelming in its content from what Stiefel told Heidemann. It said things like, I signed a couple of decrees today, or I called Hermann Göring, and nothing else. But it was supposedly a diary of Adolf Hitler, and every page of it was signed with a signature that looked like Adolf Hitler. And so Heidemann became obsessed. He tried to approach Henry Nannen for money and for support in tracking it down, but Nannen, who had previously given Heidemann money for a book he was supposed to write about the conversations he had with old Nazis on board of Göring's yacht, which was called Board Conversations, Deckgespräche in German, was rather frustrated with Heidemann at this point because Heidemann never got around to writing the book. And so instead of to Nannen, he went to the editor for the history article department in Stern, a man named Peter Walde. And together with Walde, he started tracking down the diaries and their supposedly mysterious source. And what they stumbled across is also something that I think we also came across in the research for the Death of Hitler episode, which was in April 1945. When they cleared the bunker, they also evacuated Nazi documents by the troves to the Alpine fortress and elsewhere. And among the planes that were supposed to bring out a bunch of Nazi documents, also a bunch of personal documents by Hitler, was one that was shot down near Dresden in a hamlet named Böhnersdorf. And Hitler, when receiving the news that this plane was shot down, went white, according to one witness, and exclaimed, "In that plane were my private archives. It's a catastrophe." Several historians have commented on the potential content of these trunks, and among the likely contenders for what was in that plane was Hitler's correspondence with Himmler, which, given that it would make it a very interesting thing to read, actually. But apparently what happened was that it burned up. But Heidemann didn't know that. Instead, he went with Walde to Böhnersdorf and he questioned the inhabitants, and they mentioned rumors about somebody surviving the plane crash and so on and so forth. But this energized them for finding the diaries and finding the man who had access to the diaries now. And through a variety of their contacts in the neo-Nazi milieu and the collectors milieu, Heidemann heard of a man named Fischer, who called himself Fischer. And on January 18, 1981, he called Fischer for the first time and asked him about the Hitler Diaries. The man was adamant that he not disclose any information about that because he said that he had access to the contents of the trunk from the Böhnersdorf crash, albeit through his brother, who was a general in the East German army and who would regularly smuggle out documents from that trunk to West Germany. But if anybody knew about him, he would lose his life and end up in an East German jail. But the things he had in that trunk, oh man. He told him that he had Hitler diaries spanning from 1933 to 1945, Hitler paintings, the gun that Hitler used to commit suicide, and other assorted Hitler memorabilia, including my personal favorite, an opera supposedly written by Hitler called Wieland the Blacksmith. Heidemann obviously was on board with everything, and he immediately went to the higher-ups in the company, bypassing his editorial board, who had told him in no uncertain terms that they weren't interested. He went to his managers at Gruner & Jahr, which is a company that is owned by Bertelsmann, a very famous, large German mega corporation, and Gruner & Jahr managed its publishing arm, which included Stern. And so Heidemann met Jan Hensmann, the company deputy manager and protege of the owner of Bertelsmann, who was sent to Gruner & Jahr to cut his teeth out as a manager. And so Heidemann goes to Hensmann's office and he lays out before him the highlights of his own collection of Hitler memorabilia to dazzle him and tell him about the diaries he found. And to my eternal surprise, it worked. Hensmann was completely on board. And since he didn't like the Stern editorial board, namely Peter Koch, he was also on board with not divulging any further information to them, but instead keeping it all in-house with only Heidemann and the people at Gruner & Jahr involved. And he immediately agreed to pay 85,000 mark for each volume of the diary, 200,000 mark for an alleged third volume of Mein Kampf that the man called Fischer allegedly had, and 500,000 marks for the remainder of the archive. That was basically a huge amount of money in 1981. Like huge. That amounts to tenfold today. And so, with his briefcase full of 1,000 mark notes, Heidemann goes to the village named Ditzingen near Stuttgart and turns up at the front door of one man named Konrad Kujau. And for Kujau, it all started with vouchers. Luncheon vouchers worth 27 marks to be exact. That was the first act of known forgery by the man Konrad Kujau, committed in 1963. Kujau was born in East Germany and didn't have a very good childhood. His family was poor and had been bombed out in the Second World War, and they were not on best of terms with the East German authorities. So Konrad had to go and work from a very early age on. He didn't have a father, and his mother died when he was very young, and so he ended up with an uncle in West Berlin, and there he didn't have a very good time either, and went on further to West Germany to become a refugee. He was poor, he was destitute, but he had a penchant for finding semi-legal activities to keep himself afloat. He went by several names, naming himself Konrad Fischer, Peter Fischer, Dr. Fischer, or also the General. And he liked to tell stories, so much so that some people said he was a compulsive liar. I think one source even mentions that he would contradict his own story twice in the same police investigation where they questioned him about his whereabouts and his name. So he gave them 3 different names in the same police interview. But anyway, what really had started earning him money was first selling historical paintings where people paid him to paint them into historical scenes. His most valuable effort was a portrait of one of his clients for 2,000 marks, where his client was to be seated next to Erwin Rommel in his death car in the North African War Theater of World War II. And with that money he made, he started buying war militaria and memorabilia. And he and his wife, Edith, really started smuggling old stuff out of East Germany, which was blatantly illegal, but a very profitable sort of business. Like they would go to East Germany to get the Nazi stuff relatives had left behind, or the Wehrmacht stuff relatives had left behind, and smuggle it to West Germany to sell it there. And here is where Kujau's real career starts, because what he starts doing is he starts faking notes that say stuff is authentic for his clients. Like he would go and buy some kind of World War II helmet, but then fake a note from Rudolf Höss that said, you know, this is the Führer's helmet from World War I. I think one of his most infamous paintings from that time includes a huge painting depicting battling German infantrymen in Flanders in 1918 that he said was painted by Adolf Hitler, and had a note attached to it that said, "I painted this for my comrades who fell in the field, Adolf Hitler." But that actually, if one looks closer, showed in the background a smiling Hitler in a battle scene, ready to throw a hand grenade at his comrades in the foreground. I've tried to track down a picture of it, and there isn't really a good one aside from like one newspaper article. And it really, if one looks closer, it really shows like a very grinning Hitler ready to throw a grenade at his friends. And I don't know how they did not, I don't know how the person who bought this missed this, but this is a running theme in this entire episode. Like, how can you miss this is a question that tends to come up very often when we talk about this affair, I guess.
I mean, it's the kind of thing where I feel like the person who was like, "Oh, I can't wait to buy a Hitler painting," is that I don't feel like they're going to really be questioning that kind of detail that might fit into what they want. This entire episode is so much of people seeing something, wanting it to be that thing that they want. Okay, this must be it. And I feel like this painting just falls into that milieu there.
Absolutely. And Fritz Stiefel was obviously one of the people who was really into all of this, because he became one of Kuyao's best customers over the years. And I think somewhere it mentioned that Kuyao once basically wrote out the entire published text of Mein Kampf in Hitler's script, which he imitated, and sold it for several thousand marks to Stiefel, claiming it was the original manuscript of the book.
But Hitler didn't actually write it. How did you get away with that? He dictated it. Someone else wrote it.
I know. I have no idea. They like these people didn't do their research, which is basically like the next point after he sold Stiefel these pieces. Stiefel showed them to a man named August Brisack, who was originally had been employed by the Nazi Party in the 1930s to track down false and authentic Hitler paintings and buy them or destroy them. And he fooled Brisack. Brisack said it's totally authentic.
These are the people who they would totally buy a bridge in Brooklyn if you tried to sell it to them.
Yeah. yes. But but the thing is, the next thing is, it's not just them. It's also people who are professionally invested in that. He also fooled West German historian Eberhard Jäckel, who is a known quantity in terms of studies of the Third Reich. And Jäckel published a book that is a collection of Hitler's early writing. And he included poems that had been written by Kuyao. 75 poems that had been forged by Konrad Kuyao appeared in the volume published by Eberhard Jäckel, including one called An Idyll in War, which described how Hitler supposedly delivered a French woman's baby in World War I in rhyme stanza. It really is absurd. And I mean, Jäckel, who will become important later, was bitten in the ass by this, because people noticed that some of the poems were verbatim copies of other World War I or even earlier poetry that basically Kuyao just copied out without giving thought to changing it or anything. He just copied them verbatim, and Jäckel fell for it and was blasted for it. But, you know, he will become important later on, but nobody managed to connect the dots yet. So Heidemann goes to Kuyao, and the two talk, and Heidemann hands over a briefcase full of money to get one of the diaries. And Kuyao says, well, he gets the one from Stiefel back, presumably having a very uncomfortable conversation about that one. And then goes to forge another one. He goes to buy black-bound school books from a school book supplier, together with some kind of ink he buys. And he sits down in the morning and he takes out one particular book which he used as his main source, although over the years he would amass a research library of about 500 volumes of Hitler books, and then starts churning out a description of the kind of decrees and speeches Hitler had given, because his main source was a 4-volume collection of Hitler's speeches and decrees by a man named Max Domarus. In the end, he sticks a red wax seal on the covers, forges a label by Rudolf Hess declaring them to be genuine, and uses tea to age the paper and bashing them against the table to age the outside. And then he calls Heidemann and says, you know, for only 85,000 marks, they are yours. And Heidemann buys them. He buys them and he brings them to Hamburg, and he presents them to several of the executives at Gruner & Jahr, including Hensmann, and they are enraptured. One of them later said, to have a diary written by him, and now I'm holding it in my grasp. We wanted to have them all. And what they claim is that the diary just cast a spell over them. And so they agreed to pay 2.5 million marks to the supposed brother of the German general. And I think personally that, you know, these people who effectively conspired against their own magazine and against the editors of their own magazine were really going down a road towards doom, because they were enraptured with Adolf Hitler and his aura and the kind of money you can make with selling Hitler. And I think this is also a good point for us to deep dive further into our own experiences, which we regularly have in terms of answering questions.
Both of us, we love to drag up that section from Kershaw where he goes on about how, as an actual person, Hitler was just like this non-entity who he had no good talents, he had no interests. He was a man of boring routine. He had no friends. He had one actual skill, which was to rile up a crowd while speaking. But he's just not an interesting person. Yet then on the other hand, we have this contradiction where people still are fascinated by him. And I mean, here we are sitting out saying Hitler's not that interesting, yet this is our second episode about Hitler. It's really strange to think about in those terms, you know?
Yeah, I think the running theme of our episodes that we did here with the death and now with the diaries is there is this very, very strong tendency among many people to believe that there must be some kind of secret behind the veil, some kind of thing that explains everything, sort of like 4D chess he was playing. And once we find his strategy, we know why the Germans were so enraptured by the man that they went on and committed genocide. And I think there's this fascination with, like, the questions we get on the sub speak to this fascination when you have, what did Hitler think about the Mongolians, and what did Hitler think about the Indians, and so on and so forth. I pretty much have given up answering these questions by now, but there is a copy of Hitler's Table Talk that I have that I bought just for the purpose of looking up stuff people were asking in the subreddit.
Yeah, and I think the most charitable way to think about it is people want to understand Hitler as a person because they do recognize the evil of the Nazis. They recognize what happened, and they want to just find some way to understand it. And I see it as two competing things because on the one hand, they want to get to know Hitler in a way that makes him that unique figure of evil that he is made out to be in pop culture. Because I think that people would want to think about him as unique, the Nazis as unique, as something that happened once that can never happen again. So if you can understand Hitler as being this very unique person with all these unique things about him, it makes it, I don't want to say more distant, but it makes it safer to not have to worry about those kinds of things. Whereas I think that us as historians, we do these episodes and we try to deconstruct that because Hitler wasn't that unique. He's not some singular aberration in history. Christopher Browning, his title of his book, Ordinary Men, is because this is something that can happen anywhere.
Exactly. Like the key to the Holocaust and to World War II lies in an analysis of social dynamics, mechanisms, interpersonal group dynamics, and dependencies and mechanisms in a society that shape the things that occurred in these years, and not one person that holds the answer. And I think that with the Hitler Diaries affair, what is especially insidious also about it, and which is, and also a reason why I'm very glad that these people all fell flat on their face, more or less, is that there is a willingness to sell this to people. There is a willingness to use this for economical gain in a way that engages with what I think psychoanalysis will call the Angstlust, the lust for fear in reading about Hitler. And the people at Gruner and Yacht definitely were people who saw like cash signs when they saw the diaries.
And you already brought up, we see these questions on the sub, and I think that it really just speaks to, I don't want to use the word appeal, but this desire to, what was the term you used, reading for fear?
Angstlust.
Because I mean, I think at least once a month we get someone who's asking, which translation of Mein Kampf should I read? It's literally one of the worst books ever written, not simply because it's Mein Kampf, but because I was doing that preliminary research, I found that footnote and I shared it with you. Someone calculated that there's a grammatical or spelling error every 5 words in Mein Kampf because it's literally just strictly politically neutral prose. It is just the absolute worst book you could possibly read. But people seem to think that it gives you this deep understanding of Hitler, and they want to read his words and they want to do that fear read. They want to see who he is, but it's an empty book. It's an empty book of bad grammar and bad spelling.
Indeed, and people are like, when we get these questions, I always wonder if people do not want to engage with the actual context of the book, because everywhere you read about the book, it's fairly clear that the purpose of this book was PR, basically, and it deals in large parts, together with the second book, it deals in large parts with the question of Southern Tyrol, and should we get Southern Tyrol back from the Italians, which is a question that in the minds of all but a few people today is pretty much dead. And why would you read about what Hitler thought in the 1920s about the Southern Tyrol question? It gives you virtually no insight into anything, basically.
Almost 800 pages long, and if I had to guess, there's maybe 20 pages that are actually worth reading because they're actually relevant to understanding. And almost every single one of those is going to be quoted in something like Kershaw or something like Evans. The secondary literature does an excellent job summarizing anything you're going to find out from it.
Exactly, but I think with Mein Kampf and also with the Hitler Diaries, in the end, what also caused the downfall of these people is that nobody ever read what was in them, because aside from some choice quotes that Stern would later plaster everything with, it literally says, I signed a couple of decrees today, and it's painfully boring. The content of these books, painfully boring, because it's basically it's a duty calendar that has been copied. And just imagine if somebody would today copy your Google calendar and say, well, this is the real stuff that gets you to the deeper understanding of the man. It's absurd.
I guess there is a little bit of irony. We're talking about him being a boring person, and the diaries are really boring. Sounds accurate to me.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, the only person involved in this whole affair, which we will get to, that basically was aware of the absurdity of everything from the start was Kuyao, who forged, because he was the only one who recognized what kind of bullshit he was putting out there and was continually amazed that he got away with it.
I have to wonder, obviously at the beginning, he was probably just laughing his way to the bank on this stuff. But you have to wonder at some point when the publicity started getting really high, I wonder where it was that he was like, oh shit, I think I might have got too far.
I mean, I think we will get to that point, but before we get there, I think it's also important to know that everybody involved in this really saw the cash signs in their eyes, because over the next, the whole thing would go on for about 2 years, and Heidemann would also increasingly come back to Stern and tell them, or to Gruner and Jahr, and tell them, that Fischer now needs more money for his brother and to hide him and so on and so forth. And it would later come out that Heidemann basically started skimming off the top very early on, and about half the money Gruner and Jahr gave him for the diaries, he put in his own pocket without ever telling Kuyao that he was pocketing money. And it all went downhill from the moment on where they decided to buy them, in the sense that warning signs started showing up immediately. When Heidemann showed the diaries to one of his SS friends, the General Monke, he pointed out that they were full of mistakes, because Monke knew, because he was there. He told Heidemann that this was not how it happened, but Heidemann was unperturbed by what he told him and insisted, maybe Hitler just wrote it down how he wanted it to happen. And that's the reason why it differs from reality. And this went on for a while, and it was only when Pope John Paul II was shot that the editors of Stern, who wanted Heidemann to go to the story on it, tracked him down and noticed that he hadn't worked for them effectively for several months now. So they went to management and asked them what's going on with Heidemann. And Gruner and Jahr told them and divulged to them that they had the Hitler Diaries, and it was the biggest scoop they were ever gonna get involved in. And unlike Gruner and Jahr, who were enjoying their hush-hush parade a bit too much, the editors of Stern had immediate alarm bells going off, because what they were worried about is, we need to show this to legal. Who owns the Hitler Diaries? Because as we know from previous podcast episodes, the legal situation concerning the Hitler estate is rather complicated. And there are several people who are weird involved. There is the state of Bavaria, who owns the copyrights to Hitler's publications, because he Bavaria was the last known residence of Adolf Hitler. But there's also the Hitler family, including his sister Paula, who was dead by the time the Hitler Diaries affair started, and the rest of Hitler's family, who had put a man named Werner Maser in charge of their affairs in the state. And previous listeners will know that we have a lot of thoughts on Werner Maser.
Werner Maser is my favorite Hitler historian, as long as we're using favorite to mean what the fuck is this guy smoking? He is such a odd guy. As people will recall from our previous episode, he was one of those voices who he agreed that Hitler died, killed himself when he did, but any evidence that actually came up, he just decided it wasn't real.
Indeed, and show up he did. Maser, who, as you said, was known for his shit takes on history, including, I think, one that Hitler had an illegitimate French son from World War I.
Oh, yes. In the 1970s, he decides that this guy named Jean-Marie Lorette, who is a Frenchman, was actually Hitler's love child, based on no evidence whatsoever beyond his mother supposedly claiming his father might have been Hitler on her deathbed in the late 1940s. Werner Maser, for reasons which I assume have money involved, decides, yep, definitely 100% legitimate. Well, illegitimate, but legitimate.
In this very instance, this man told Heidemann that he doubted the veracity of the diaries. So when Werner Maser tells you, this might be going a tad too far, you maybe start to worry about what you have there. But Heidemann was, again, unperturbed. And because of his insistence, Maser was like, okay, I will sell you the legal rights to all of Hitler's diaries for the mere price of 20,000 marks. And they drew up an agreement, and Maser signed over the rights to the diaries to Heidemann.
I think we also need to just focus on the fact that he's an historian, but he also is so intimately involved with the Hitler family. And I feel like there's definitely not like historians take a Hippocratic oath, but there's definitely some violation ethically of what he was doing here.
Oh, absolutely.
He's trying to be a scholar of the guy, but he is possibly the legal executor of his estate. I think it also is interesting to tie us back to what we were talking about earlier, because Bormann was the actual executor of Hitler's estate. So he was declared dead in 1973 after they found his body. And then because the family then appoints Maser, there was a whole legal battle over whether he actually had that position. And I believe that the Hitler Diaries settled that. The publisher having to get lawyers to determine whether he actually had those legal rights. And he probably didn't, because the family, I don't think that they had the right to just appoint an executor on their own volition there, but it's so weird.
It is, and the guy would deserve his own episode at some point, but here he he turns up here and later on to tell everyone that he always knew it's been a fake. But here he turns up and he knows these things are not real, because despite all his shady dealings and his profiting, he's basically Hitler profiteering. The guy does know what he's doing to some extent. And he knows these things are not real.
I don't want to say he's a bad historian. I feel like he's a capable historian, I think is the best term. He's a capable historian with some weird opinions. And I don't think we'll ever need to do a Werner Maser episode, because anytime we do an episode about weird Hitler things, he's always going to show up anyways.
True. But I mean, we could do one on the collected oeuvre of Werner Maser at some point. But that is for another day, because I think now is the time to tell the story of how Stern tries to get these things authenticated, because they do. And they agree that, as part of the whole legal deal, it's time to see, to do their due diligence if they are really, really real. And this is truly the point in time where everything should have fallen down and everyone would have been embarrassed and Kuya would have probably gone to prison. But Stern would still have his reputation, and Heidemann would probably have to eat some crow, but could work again. But alas, that was not to be, because Stern was so adamant about not giving away the scoop they had that they did two things. The first one was a handwriting analysis. and of one page of the diary, which they had cut out as to not give the whole thing away. And the questions of the veracity of handwriting analysis aside, the whole project was doomed to fail from the start because the comparison samples Stern supplied to various experts came from the collection of one Gerd Heidemann supplied by one Konrad Kujau. So they basically had Kujau's handwriting being compared to Kujau's handwriting, and surprisingly, 60% were found to be accurate.
If anything, that says something really bad about the handwriting authenticators. It was 100% match, guys, and you only thought 60%.
One would assume so, but it wasn't going to be. It didn't work out that way. And the other thing they did was they approached the German Bundesarchiv, which are the federal archives, and they too gave them a couple of pages from the diaries and some other documents that Kujau had forged, and tell them that they would like to have them tested forensically, and if they turn out to be true, then after Stern publishes these documents, which they never identify as the diaries, the Bundesarchiv will get them. And the Bundesarchiv has lots of things to do, and therefore this is not a priority for them. Like, they put that on the bottom of the list and say, well, we'll get to it when we'll get to it. It's not our most important activity right now. So keep that in mind, that while all this is going on, there is something at the Bundesarchiv being tested, albeit it takes some time. And so they start working on their publication strategy. In 1982, Gruner and Jahr plans to come out swinging with their Hitler Diaries project. They want to start off big, and that means that they're going to start off with what they call Plan 3, which is the code word Kujau came up with in one of the diaries for Hess' flight to England in 1941. Because Kujau, having a sense of humor, decides that he's going to put something spectacular in there. He feels like it was going to be fun. And so he says that Hitler knew about Hess' flight to Britain all along. He knew about the plan, it was his idea, he called it Plan 3, and only if it didn't work, he would disavow Hess and say he had no idea, and that his deputy Führer had planned it in secret, and so on and so forth. So this was basically a private little joke by Kujau, but for Stern, it was the most explosive piece of writing they had in there. Never mind that Hess was still alive at this point, and they could have asked him about it. He was literally sitting in Spandau prison at that point in time. Old, but they could have still asked him about it. But no, they were adamant that this was their big hit, and they were going to start with that. And that was going to open like a whole publishing calendar for the Diaries project.
It's an interesting little tidbit. As you bring up, it's something that they actually could have checked with Hess. I don't know how far they would have gotten with that. We've already been talking about how mundane the diary is. It feels like that should have been just this massive red flag. Here's Hitler talking about, oh, I signed a decree. Oh, I did this. It's all this stuff that's like public, easily accessible information, and he's just keeping track of it in his day planner. And then suddenly he puts, oh, and by the way, my top secret plan, which literally no one knew about, even my closest friends and aides, this is what we were going to do. I realize we have hindsight and we're able to just look back and judge these people for what they were doing, but it just seems there should have been cooler heads prevailing here. Someone should have been like, wait a second, why is this here?
I mean, because they didn't have anybody who was really capable of checking the veracity with scholarship, because they didn't want to involve anybody, and the only people who could read the diary were Heidemann and Warden. Nobody else could read what was in it because they couldn't read the script. And so they were easily led to believe that, there were hundreds of interesting tidbits and nuggets in there, when in reality there were maybe like 5 or 6 things that Kujau had incorporated there that would make for a historically interesting tidbit in the end. And the whole thing deteriorates further because at this point, Stern starts shopping this around internationally. And they approach, among other people, Rupert Murdoch and the Times and Sunday Times in Britain for international publication. And these are the people who, for the first time, insist that actual historians start checking this work. So at this point, historians get involved. I mean, there were a couple that had already been involved. I talked about Eberhard Jäckel, who had published the fake poems. But there is another person who was already on the trail of the Hitler Diaries as well, and that's David Irving. Our good old friend David Irving makes an appearance.
And I think it's important to point out that for people familiar with the name, this episode is happening right at that tilting point. Hitler's War had been published only a few years before, and that's when people really were starting to be like, wait a second, you're not really saying what I think you're saying.
Indeed, because at this time he was heavily involved with German neo-Nazi politics, which is how he got on the trail of the diaries. But at the same time, he was one of the few historians who had complete access to all the people who might have still, undiscovered documents. He did indeed discover previously unknown documents in his quest, because he was able to talk to Traudl Junge on her couch and talk her into giving him that stuff, because they knew him to be politically reliable. That's what they knew about him. That, as well as, brazen illegality, was how he got a lot of his documents. Did you know that he stole one of the original copies of Goebbels' diary in 1991 from the archive in Moscow?
Wow. Wow. I did not know that.
This whole episode also goes to show that he knows what he's doing, because he meets Stiefel and looks at the supposedly original 1935 volume of the diary, which he then makes copies of, which is going to become important later. But he knows these things, and he looks at them and he knows immediately that they're fake, because he knows that Hitler, like the longest piece of writing from Hitler in his time in power, is a piece about the 4-year plan, I think. And it's barely 5 pages long, written by hand originally. And everybody knows that, the guy didn't like to write. And so Irving immediately recognizes that this is shit. Unlike the next person who gets involved here, which is Hugh Trevor Roper.
Our friend from the Hitler's Death episode. And I think that it's important to point out that Hugh Trevor Roper is not a German historian. He got into the whole Hitler studies because he worked in British intelligence. And I believe that it pretty much was just his superiors like, hey, Hugh, you were trained as an historian. You might be good at doing this. How about you go interview these people and figure out what happened? And suddenly he now has to be a Hitler expert.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fair to say that the book about Hitler's death, which we referenced extensively in our previous episode, is one that kickstarted his career, because he made a decent career going from Oxford to Cambridge and becoming a prominent academic and public intellectual in Great Britain. And it all started with the report on Hitler's death, basically. And therefore, when the Times gets wind of Stern's Hitler Diaries plans, they call none other than Hugh Trevor Roper, who is also part of their editorial staff. Like, he's some kind of like external editor they like to bring in to write down things that, like op-eds they want to publish and stuff like that. So they call him in, and they fly him to Switzerland, where Stern has, in the meantime, stored the diaries. And when they hear that, Hugh Trevor Roper's coming, the Hitler expert is in town, Stern decides, well, we need to put on a show for Roper. And so they bring him to the Swiss bank vault in April of 1983. And there they lay out, all the volumes they have, which at this point in time must be like 30 or something. It was close to being finished. So they lay out these black covered diaries there, and they include other stuff that Heidemann has bought either for his own collection or for Stern's collection, which is Hitler paintings, which was Kujaw's real passion, was forging Hitler paintings, because Hitler paintings are super easy to forge, because the man produced like nobody's business and was not very talented. So it was really easy for, like, Kuja would say at one point he was able to like knock out an original Hitler Kuja in about a day. But they include his alleged helmet from World War I and various drawings and memorabilia and so on and so forth, all in with the intention of dazzling Trevor Roper. And Trevor Roper comes there and is indeed dazzled, and also has a fundamental problem. As you mentioned, he's not a German historian. He's a specialist in 16th and 17th century British history. And as such, he does not speak German, nor read German script. So what happens in that bank vault is you have basically you, Trevor Roper, just sitting there staring at these documents, not being able to read them, and having to rely on Gerd Heidemann to read the diaries for him. It's absurd. The idea that you have this expert sitting there who is quite clearly not the expert that is needed to review all of this. But it worked because Trevor Roper is so impressed, because he would later say that his thinking was, who would go through all the trouble of forging 35 volumes of Hitler Diaries that way? Just the sheer volume of the archive was what convinced him that it must be real.
That's probably the worst possible logic he could have come up with.
Indeed, and it's a disaster. Like, he signs an NDA with them, and the only thing he does is he says that he believes them to be genuine. It's his opinion, and he will write a editorial for the Sunday Times to that effect. But he must insist that a German colleague of his also take a look at these things. And so Stern asks him, well, who should we ask? And he says, well, I've got this good friend here in Stuttgart. His name is Eberhard Jäcker. But they never get around to showing Eberhard Jäcker these diaries. Instead, the next historian they bring in, which comes from the fact that Stern is greedy. And so next to Murdoch, who owns the Times and Sunday Times, as well as various other publications, they also approach Newsweek in the US for the international publication, with the idea of like driving up the price in negotiating with Murdoch. And Newsweek also says they need a historian. And they bring in the first person who actually knows what they're doing, which is Gerhard Weinberg. Weinberg is a historian at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He's worked with Browning, who we already mentioned. And he was the principal author of the US Army's Guide to Capture German Records in the National Archives. So this is the first person who knows what they're doing. But the problem is that because Newsweek is urging him, he basically tells them, well, he's got classes at UNC, and so he only has an afternoon. They have to fly him out to Zurich. He will be there for a couple of hours, and then they have to fly him back so that he won't miss class.
He's a good professor, at least. He cares about his students. He doesn't seem to care much about these diaries, but he cares about his students. I appreciate that.
Indeed, he plays a very undeserved role in this whole affair.
I don't want to rag on Weinberg too much. His single volume history of the war, I think, is the one that we probably recommend the most on the subreddit because it's really good. He's a really good writer.
Absolutely, and he's very diligent, because when he flies to Zurich to test these things, what he brings with him is the diary of Hitler's chauffeur Heinz Linge, which is in the National Archives. And therefore, Kujau would have never had access to them. So he plans on taking the diary of Linge and comparing them to the alleged diary of Hitler. Only the time frame that is covered in Linge's diary is still missing in the Stern archive. So Weinberg goes and checks the rest, but with an afternoon, he only can ever pull basically quick samples of the subject matter and can't really say what's going on and refuses to make a judgment on it. He too is flabbergasted by the size of the archive, but he is very reticent on saying something very definitively. The only thing he tells Stern is that they need to have it checked by a German historian, and he's got this good colleague in Stuttgart whose name is Eberhard Jäcker.
Is he the only historian who lives in Germany? Because everyone seems to want him to be the guy who does this.
No, he is... How do I put this? Jäcker is the one conservative Nazi historian in Germany, together with Bracher. They're the two conservatives who stood against Tim Mason in the intentionalism and functionalism debate, and who are known to like they're not left-wingers, and therefore everybody recommends them.
So basically, they're the ones who like, look, if you need something to be authenticated, if these guys come in and say they're authentic, they're probably authentic just because they're going to be the most strict in their judgments.
That, and they're not, they're not interested in like besmirching someone's reputation for left-wing reasons or for sympathy towards East Germany or something weird like that. That's basically the background of Jäckler. He's like the conservative Hitler guy. But still, they do not show these things to Jäckler. Instead, they go ahead. Their gamble with Newsweek doesn't work, and they're forced to go back to Murdoch and sell it to him for less money than originally intended. But they go ahead. And on April 22nd in 1983, Stern was poised to announce the existence of the diaries and the forthcoming publication of the first of many special Stern editions with over 400 pages. Like, this was a magazine with over 400 pages they planned to put out. And announcing a large press conference on April 25th, 2 days later. And they had produced an entire documentary about the process of discovering it, featuring extensive interviews with Heidemann and also some short interviews with Trevor Roper. And basically at 11:15, the juggernaut started rolling, and the first telex went out that announced what Stern was planning to do and what they had discovered. And their grandiose language stated, with these documents, the entire history of Adolf Hitler has to be written anew. And at the same time, precisely at the same time, they received a call from the forensic expert at the Bundesarchiv. The diary pages they had submitted were unclear if they were from before 1945 or after. But what was definitely fake was the ink and the glue, because those were not produced before 1945. And those were pages that contained the handwriting that had been used to verify the diaries. So this was... While the forensic might be ambiguous on some of the pages, the fact that the documents that were used as reference samples were all fake should have told them that, things were not going well. But they ignored that at that point. Heidemann told them everything was fine, and this is just a mistake, and the Bundesarchiv doesn't like us, and so they went ahead, and they had the international press landscape reeling. Everyone was forced to issue a statement, and Trevor Roper's article appeared in the Sunday Times, praising the material as genuine, and saying this was a great discovery, and while the history of the Third Reich wouldn't have to be rewritten exactly, it was gonna be something that historians would deal with for years to come.
And of course, he had no clue what was actually written in it because he'd never read them.
Exactly, but he said, what he later claimed was, he said he trusted Stern that they would have verified with actual German historians and the Bundesarchiv. He said he was very surprised that immediately various German historians, including Eberhard Jäckler, came out and said they were extremely skeptical of the material and couldn't believe that it was real. And Werner Maser was quoted saying, "The whole thing reeks to me of sensationalism."
And if Werner Maser is saying that you are reeking of sensationalism, you are reeking of sensationalism. We got to be clear.
Yes. The man who claimed that Hitler had an illegitimate French son said this was sensationalism. I mean, this should have given them alarm, but who really gave them alarm was, again, David Irving, who began parading around everywhere he could, showing off the copies he had made of Stiefel's diary and telling everyone it was fake. And I mean everyone. He was invited the same night on the BBC to declare them fake in a discussion format. This was really the last hooray of David Irving before everyone knew he was a Holocaust denier, or before everyone had the balls to call him a Holocaust denier. But here they loved him. They invited him everywhere. And under these circumstances, Roper did budge. He told the Sunday Times that, he had reservations. He was not into it anymore. He didn't want to do it. But Rupert Murdoch said, well, screw you, Roper. We're going to do it. And the Sunday Times basically browbeat him into going to Hamburg and taking part in the press conference. And it was embarrassing because on April 25th in 1983, Stern published its big coverage of the diaries, including a photo of one of the diaries that had FH on the cover on the front page of Stern. And they had their press conference, and everybody trotted out and spoke until it came to Trevor Roper, who, after seeing himself in the documentary that had been made where he said this is a great find and will completely change the landscape, said at the press conference that the normal method of historical verification has perhaps necessarily been sacrificed to some extent for the journalistic scoop. And the people from Stern were pissed. Like, you can see the photos of them sitting next to him, arms crossed with scowls on their faces, especially in light of the next thing that happened, which was David Irving jumping up from the audience and starting asking questions about the fake diaries he had found.
Is this recording saved, or is that just... I want to try and find this.
There are photos of it. I'm not sure if there's a TV recording of it. I haven't found one, but there are photos that show like everyone being scowling at Trevor Roper while Irving waves around his photocopies of the fake diary. And this disaster set off a media frenzy. They had a discussion on live television in Germany between Peter Koch, the editor of Stern, and David Irving about the veracity of the diaries. And oh boy, it did not go well for any of the involved. It was quickly becoming an absolute disaster. And the news media internationally started doubting. The Eastern Bloc called the whole thing into question and said it was a publicity stunt to humanize Hitler. And Stern just was forced that, at this point in time, we have to get them verified to show how everybody is wrong and we are right. And so they submitted the whole thing to the Bundesarchiv for extensive testing and textual analysis. And the textual analysis was done by, among others, the head of the Bundesarchiv, who took some volumes home with them one evening with him and read them there, and is reported to have said, "I don't care if they are forged or not. They are so boring, so meaningless, it hardly makes any kind of difference." In that spirit, they found that, not only did most of the books contain paper whitener, which was not produced before 1945, but also glue and ink that did not match, that all the labels were typed on the same machine with no wear on the typeface, and that the content was rife with mistakes as well. Like, Hitler would claim that the law was passed in 1934 when it was really passed in 1933. He would say that he received a letter from somebody when in reality he had written a letter to that same somebody, and so on and so forth. And it didn't take long for them to find out that these were the same small mistakes that all showed up in Max Domaro's 4-volume Hitler Speeches and Proclamations. And this was an embarrassment for Stern, because originally they had said to the Bundesarchiv that they wanted to hear first about the state of the authentication. But the Bundesarchiv is a federal agency and reported it upstairs. And the Helmut Kohl government was not on very good footing with Stern, because Stern had a sort of like liberal left-wing editorial line, and Kohl was not a fan of them. And so the German government took the chance to completely embarrass Stern, and the Bundesarchiv had a press release before Stern could have one about how everything was fake. And so it came crumbling down. I think this is the moment when Kuyao noticed that things were not going well, because it is the moment where he loaded his wife into his car, then drove to Stuttgart to his mistress's house and loaded his mistress into his car. And then they drove off to his mistress's parents in Austria, where they would spend the next 3 weeks, which I imagine is not a very fun experience.
Not at all. But also, isn't this the point where David Irving is suddenly like, oh wait, maybe these actually are real? Now that he sees some of the content, some of it actually kind of supports his bullshit thesis in Hitler's War. So he's like, oh, maybe I want to use this as a source.
Yes, over the previous week, he had changed his mind after going on television with Peter Koch. And because it was mentioned that the diaries were very adamant about portraying Churchill and Roosevelt as the real forces behind the war, which of course fits very well with Irving's hypotheses. He started to endorse them at some point until the Bundesarchiv declared them fake, when he started talking about how he had been the first one to declare them fake, and led to a British journalist quipping, and the last one to declare them authentic as well.
It's a pretty solid burn.
I would say that's an A+ burn. But yes, so Irving was one of them who said it was real at some point.
I have to wonder what his logic was there. He has this great coup and he's totally got it in the bag. He's going to be the historian who called it. And then right when everything's about to actually agree with him, he's like, oh, wait, no, I'm going to take the other.
I don't know. Like Richard Harris, when writing about it, says he likes to be a contrarian, so he didn't want to be on the same side as Jäckel and Bracha, but
I don't disagree with that, I guess, but I guess he must have assumed that, yes, I'm right, but no one else is going to believe me, and they're going to publish these, and everyone's going to just say they're real, so I might as well get what I can out of it.
Probably, or it could also be a bit to prolong his relevance in the whole affair, because when other people started being invited for declaring them fake because so many other historians jumped on that train, it was then that Irving said suddenly, well, maybe they're authentic after all.
All publicity is good publicity, I guess.
Certainly for David Irving. But, I mean, at least he wasn't as deluded as Gerd Heidemann, because Heidemann apparently insisted that the Bundesarchiv was wrong and that he was going to prove it, because what he was going to do is he would find Martin Bormann to authenticate the diaries.
Who, again, has been declared dead for 10 years because they found his body.
Exactly. But Heidemann was obsessed with finding Bormann at this point, and through contacts of a Swiss gun collector, he thought that he would meet Bormann on several occasions, but obviously did not. And so, without Martin Bormann showing up, and with Heidemann being subjected to a very gruesome interview by his superiors to get the name of the person who supplied him the diaries out of him, Kujau was arrested, and it came to light that Heidemann had taken the money from Stern. Heidemann and Kujau were both indicted, and Stern would have to find heads to roll. And they settled on, among others, Peter Koch and his fellow editors, who, I remind you, had nothing to do with the whole affair because they were brought in late. If they had handled it from the beginning, it would have never gotten that far. But they got a big payout. They both got 3.5 million mark as a settlement, which, fair. But their heads were those who had to roll. And Stern never recovered from this. The magazine still exists, but it's never managed to regain its reputation as a serious news organization. It mostly these days sells magazines by putting half-naked or naked women on the cover and putting sensational stories on the inside. But it's never been the same again. And while Peter Koch and his fellow editor got off lightly, Heidemann and Kujau both went to jail for their role in the affair. Both were released in 1987, but they took very different trajectories. Kujau enjoyed the fame the whole thing brought him. He would go on to have an artist shop in Stuttgart where he would sell official Kujau forgeries of Hitler, of Salvador Dali, of everyone else he wanted to fake. He enjoyed this and got something out of it. And for the first time in his life, he was really successful faking other people's paintings. But he died in 2000 of cancer. Gerd Heidemann, on the other hand, is still alive. And he is very, very bitter if his interviews are anything to go by. In 2002, it also came to light that he at one point apparently had been an informant for East German security services, but that never went anywhere, probably. And now he lives in Hamburg, and his claim to fame is that he maintains an archive of his own and goes on to give interviews where he claims that today's journalism is all crap because the lies that have been spread about him. Of all the executives at Gruner and Jahr who bungled this, they are all still working. Not at Gruner and Jahr or Bertelsmann, but they are still successful management consultants, which I find weird, but apparently is the logic of how these things work these days, because I feel like if you bungled the biggest publishing fraud in history, you should not go on to work as a successful executive after that, but maybe that's just me.
Failing upwards is a long-established tradition. I think the most important question, though, what happened to the diaries? Where are they?
The diaries themselves also still exist, and they remain in a safe in Hamburg in Gruner and Jahr's building there. One has been sold to an anonymous bidder for $65,000. Another one went to the House of History in Bonn, and a third one went to the Police Museum in Hamburg to be put on display there. And the rest are supposed to have been handed over to the Bundesarchiv in 2013, but that has not happened to this day, and so they still are there and still cannot be seen or read by the public, which is unfortunate.
You know why they never went to the Bundesarchiv?
I don't know. Gruner and Jahr said in 2013 that they would give them to the Bundesarchiv and start the transfer, but to this day it has not happened yet, and I don't know why. It's unclear why they never would have handed them over, especially since last year they did a special episode on their anniversary as a magazine, Stern. And what they did was they published a podcast that included the audio recordings of the telephone conversations that Heidemann had with Kujau during the whole affair, which apparently also were in Stern's building. But they never handed the whole thing over. And so this is how the notorious history of the Hitler Diaries ended, with people in jail, executives shamed, a magazine ruined, and with the only person getting something out of it being Konrad Kujau, and the last hooray for later recognized Holocaust denier David Irving.
It gets back to what we were talking about earlier, though. People are just so fascinated by this idea that they can know who Hitler is by reading his writings. And all of these people, all of these, even in some cases, really good historians got suckered in. The appeal of Hitleria, I think that's what we might want to call it, it's hard to underestimate that draw.
Indeed. I think that one author called it a dark reflection of ourselves in how we deal with Hitler in connection to the whole Diaries affair. And while I personally think that's a bit too grandiose a statement, I think there is something about us in how we deal with the person of Adolf Hitler, as this whole Diaries affair shows. In the sense that what Gruner and Jahr and Stern wanted to do is make a lot of money by selling details that for them were marketed as keys to the Holocaust and to the Second World War, when in reality the answer to these questions is both more simple and more complex at the same time, in the sense that the question why the Germans committed a genocide and committed the Holocaust is one that must necessarily be answered by looking at German society and German policy of the time in a more holistic manner, and not just within the person of Adolf Hitler. And I think that the whole Hitler Diaries affair shows, among other things, that to look at Hitler and only the person Hitler is often a way to avoid asking more difficult questions about the state of society, the state of social dynamics, of group dynamics, and of seeing the parallels that exist or the continuities that still persist to this day. And so even if they were real, they probably would not hold a sufficient enough answer to the big questions about the Holocaust and about the Second World War.
Absolutely, and I could not agree more. I think that's an excellent note for us to close out on. So, thank you to everyone who gave us a listen, and a special thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon, such as Carl. Once again, this has been P.H. Jones, aka Georgi K. Zukov, and
Johannes Breit, also known as Call Me Space Invader.
And thank you for listening to our most recent Hitler episode on the Ask Historians podcast. And no doubt, stay tuned for another one down the line.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.